Hi, I'm William Ibanez, creator of Blazing Quantum, and as a fellow patron supporter, I'm helping you bring this episode. For the quality comics criticism and great creator interviews that the Comics Alternative provides, you should consider becoming a patron supporter as well.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 179, Reviews of Patience and Visual Storytelling, an Illustrated Reader. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And this week we're going to be looking at two incredibly interesting books. We're going to begin with the new one from Daniel Clowes, Patience. And then after that, we're going to look at Visual Storytelling, an Illustrated Reader, edited by Todd James Pierce and Ryan G. Van Cleave. But before we get into a discussion of those titles, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, and March is no exception, you're going to find incredible, unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often you can find discounts that go higher from there.
That's right, and this month, like every month, they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of where you get multiple comics from the same publisher for a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those issues individually. They have bundles, several bundles this month from Marvel, from DC, including DC Vertigo and DC Kids, as well as the new DC Hanna-Barbera line of comics. And in addition to Marvel and DC, you can get a bundle from Valiant where you get all 9 Valiant titles for 50% off, or from Aftershock where you get 3 new Aftershock comics for 45% off. Yeah. So check out those bundles.
Exactly. The bundle madness never ends at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website and check out to see what other kind of specials they have for this month. It's dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And as you're waiting for your comics to arrive, scratch your chin, think long and hard, and wonder, where can I get great coffee? And, you know, Andy, we have the answer to that question.
That's right. Go to justcoffee.coop, and there you can get some great coffee that's responsibly grown and distributed, and you can feel good while drinking some good coffee.
That's right. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, it's shade grown, and it's organic certified. What's more, everything is roasted to order. They do everything in small batches. There's no mass production. If you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, that's just coffee, one word, .coop, and upon checkout, make sure you put into your coupon code the word comics, COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order, and shipping is also free. No minimum order. So that's justcoffee.coop. It's a great place to get responsibly caffeinated.
That's right.
Andy, we've got some interesting titles to discuss this week. Before we get into that talk, though, let's remind our listeners that we're still doing the survey that we told you guys about a few weeks ago. It's just a simple demographic survey, and it's made up of 6 very simple questions. It should take you no more than a minute to do the survey. And if you haven't already done so, go to survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative. That's survey.libsyn, libsyn.com/comicsalternative. Answer 6 very simple, straightforward questions. And if you put your email address in the survey, you don't have to, but if you do, then you'll be entered into a drawing, and we will pull one name from that drawing, and they will win an official Comics Alternative t-shirt when we get them printed up later this year.
That's great. I hope I win.
You get one automatically.
Do I?
Yes.
Well, if I win, I'll get 2.
So you consider yourself a listener as well as a co-host.
I have been, even though I've been only kind of sporadically co-hosting of late, I have been listening, and I actually wanted to mention that I really thought that at the beginning of the month that you and Paul did a great job on the previews episode. I feel like I really enjoyed listening to that, and I'm glad Paul is on board. Because he's got a good podcasting voice.
He does, and I think he did an outstanding job, and it was hard for me to believe that he hadn't done this before.
Right.
Now, I was thinking about you as we were, or right after we recorded that, because I realized how long that episode had gone for.
Yeah.
I think that's longer than some of the episodes that you and I have done, long preview shows.
Yeah. I feel like that's what happens when I'm not around. The kids just go nuts.
Yeah.
And speaking of long episodes, I did actually really like the Evan Dorkin interview, and felt like almost like that was too short. Because I could have kept listening to that.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Gene and I mentioned this at one point, or probably more than one point. That was, had we put that up as one long interview, that would have been not only the longest interview we had ever conducted, but that would have been the longest episode period of the Comics Alternative, because the interview itself, without the intro and outro, was 2 hours and 48 minutes.
Yeah. And I enjoyed it at about 30 minutes left in the second part, where you said we have to wrap it up soon, and I looked at the amount of time left. It's like, yeah, that's not happening. But it seemed like you were providing Evan with a nice service that he as he said, he doesn't get to talk about comics very much at home, and so you were doing him a solid by letting it go.
Yeah, and he was also telling us that Sarah has warned him he better watch out for certain interviews because he tends to go on. So after we finished the recording, I told him, I hope we provided you with an outlet now.
Yeah.
That, it was successful. We put it up into 2 parts. And the thing is, after we cut off the recording for the interview, Gene and I were talking to him for another 40 minutes.
Yeah, he said that. That's I'm jealous of all that. So hopefully when I'm participating more, we can have him back on the show.
Well, Andy, let's start talking about the first title for this week, and that is Daniel Clowes' Patience. This has come out just recently from Fantagraphics. Now, it's in comic shops, but I know it won't be released, according to Amazon, into bookstores until the 21st of March. So some of our listeners may already have read Patience, or at least have a copy, and others, let's say they're ordering from Amazon, may not get it yet. Mm-hmm. But this is a big deal, a new book from Daniel Clowes.
Yeah, that's true. And before we get into the book proper, one of the things I wanted to mention in opening this book up and looking at the credits about how bittersweet it was to see Alvin Buenaventura's name in the under production and technological assistance, since we just lost him about a month ago. Alvin was responsible for, among other things, Kramer's Ergot number 7.
Right.
The giant book that is a landmark in 21st century comics, and so that was sad news to hear that he had passed, and now kind of seeing his name scroll by in the credits of Patience was kind of added to that sense of what we've lost.
Yeah. So, this book was, you mentioned time. This was a long time in coming.
It's a massive book.
Yeah. His last book was what, Wilson, or was it Mr. Wonderful? Because I don't know. Mr. Wonderful and Wilson came out not too far apart, and Mr. Wonderful was one of those comics that was originally serialized in the New York Times Magazine comic section that they used to have.
And the Death Ray is before both of those?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I know that the Death Ray was, I think, originally an 8-ball issue. It may have been the very last 8-ball issue.
Okay.
Although... And then the one before that was Ice Haven, and then they released both Ice Haven and Death Ray separately outside of 8-Ball. Interestingly enough, in last year's complete 8-Ball collection that Fantagraphics put out, neither Ice Haven nor Death Ray, if I remember correctly, I know Death Ray definitely, were not a part of the complete 8-Ball.
Huh.
Even though they were part of 8-Ball originally, but I guess because he went on to publish them separately in other editions outside of 8-Ball, they considered that outside of 8-Ball.
Huh. Well, and Patience is a pretty massive book, right? It's about 180 some pages of story, right?
Something like that. Now, you and I are reading from the review PDF, and I see... Yeah, we have 95 pages of PDF, and so let's say roughly 90 pages of story, but on our PDF, each page is a spread.
Yeah,
so we have 2 pages.
Yeah, it's about 180 pages of story. I just looked.
Yeah, so this is longer than anything he's done before, because the works that he's best known for, I guess, specifically Ghost World, that originally serialized in 8-Ball, that I can't remember the page count, but it's not that long of a narrative.
No, and that would be the same too for something like David Boring.
Boring, yeah, and also again Ice Haven and Death Ray, and then like an Iron Glove.
Like a velvet glove.
Cast in iron, yeah. I really mixed that up. But yeah, so I guess this is his longest work to date, and it's also a long time in coming. And I think that both Wilson and Mr. Wonderful came out in 2010, if I'm not mistaken. So, we've gone about 6 years without anything from Daniel Clowes, which is remarkable because when you think of legends of, let's say, contemporary comics art, in other words, people who really came to the fore, let's say in the 80s and 90s, post-underground comics. Daniel Clowes is one of those several names that stands out.
Yeah, along with Chris Ware, I would put the 2 of them up there as
Charles Burns as well.
As creators who, when a new work of theirs comes out, it's an event.
Right, exactly. And it's a little different than, let's say, other creators, as great as they are, let's say like the Hernandez brothers or even Peter Bagge, because they're more frequent in their output. So even though it's just as good, because they do it more frequently, it's not as much of an event. And I think keying in on the word event here may be a good way of getting into a discussion of Patience proper. There was a lot of hype, and still is a lot of hype, surrounding the publications of Patience.
Yeah, well, again, it's a big deal to have a new Dan Clowes book, no matter what the product ends up being, I guess. So it makes sense that Fantagraphics would go all out with their publicity machine for this book, because it'll probably be, if not their biggest book, then definitely one of their biggest books of 2016.
Right. So, I don't know, for me, and as we begin talking about this story, I'm of two minds. One mind is I want to talk about this book on its own terms outside of any paratext surrounding it,
Right.
the publicity and all of that. The expectations that we as readers, even without Fantagraphics publicity, may have for this. On the other hand, I feel that you can't look at this book without the context surrounding it, from the publicity, from the expectation, from the fact that we haven't had new Klaus since 2010, and the way that I feel about Patience, at least now, and my feelings since I first read this, and I've read it 2 or 3 times, has kind of shifted over the past few weeks. Depending on how I look at this, on its own terms, and then within the context of the hype and publicity and all that, they're kind of two different feelings that I have.
Okay.
And I don't know if you had a similar experience. Now, you were telling me earlier off mic that you tried to divorce yourself from a lot of the publicity that came out about this book.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that I saw early on, a while ago, I guess, that this book was on Fantagraphics slate for for this time of year, and I was, naturally excited by a new Dan Clowes book, and that was kind of about it. I hadn't, I was aware that we were getting emails and stuff was, showing up in different places, but I felt like that would be normal for, Fantagraphics would be stupid not to hype it, right? I mean, it's they're one of their biggest authors. So I kind of just understood that without kind of letting that impact anything I felt about the content. In fact, I really didn't know anything about the book going into it other than the title.
Yeah, because you told me that you didn't know that this was a time travel narrative.
That's right. And when I first got into it, about, I don't know how many pages into it before we realized it's like, before it at least jumps into the future, about 20 pages, I thought, oh, this is going to be maybe a more kind of realistic, contemporary work, of Klaus going back to something like Ghost World, whereas some of the other stuff has more of a, like a fantastic element, or I guess with Wilson, it's somewhat more realistic, I guess, but a different kind of narrative altogether. So I was looking at this like, oh, here's a couple, Patience, the title character, and Jack, and they're having a baby, and this is going to be, just about their lives, and then, by page 20, that gets all thrown out of whack.
Yeah. Now, I did read a lot of the publicity stuff that we got via email, and also other things that I came across. I didn't consciously seek it out, but I would either find it some places, or someone would send me a message on maybe Facebook saying, oh,
sure,
you see this write-up? And so I would read that. So I knew that we were in for a kind of sci-fi-ish narrative. There was time travel at the core of this. And also by looking at the cover in some of the publicity images that Fantagraphics put out over the past few months, it did have some kind of almost psychedelic feel to it. I mean, you can look at the book's cover, and it's just wildly colorful, and it looks like something either from the 1960s or something futuristic, or a combination of those two. And I think that may be a good way of describing this. I mean, none of it takes place in the 1960s, but to some degree, it does have a, visually speaking, kind of a 60-ish feel, if that makes sense. But it's also futuristic without going too far with the sci-fi stuff.
Yeah, there's a term I like called retrofuturism, which is the way the past looked at the future.
Yes.
And so I think that this book has that kind of quality to it, that even when he goes back to the 80s, is it the 80s
1985.
Yeah, that doesn't look. That looks more like 1960s than it does the 1980s. And then the future looks like it's something out of something, maybe a more psychedelic vision of the future that would have come out of the 60s. So yeah, it definitely has that feel.
Yeah, and in fact, when we're in the future and it's the year 2029. I couldn't help but think of Woody Allen's Sleeper. And not because you accuse me of always bringing Woody Allen into our podcast episodes. I guess I do. But, Allen was really playing around with the way that we look at the future and the way we kind of envision it. And a lot of it is just complete kitsch. And I don't want to say that Klaus's vision of 2029 is complete kitsch, but it did have at least kitsch potential in terms of the clothing and the atmosphere of the bar that he'd sent at one point.
Sure.
I mean, I found that really fun. Now, maybe we should, without giving too much away, because I think we could begin talking about this and start getting into a lot of spoiler territory. We don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. But maybe we should talk about the premise of Patience.
Yeah, so Patience and Jack at the beginning, the book starts in 2012, and Patience and Jack are expecting a baby. They've got a fairly happy but somewhat rocky relationship due to the fact that, finances are stretched thin, and Jack's work situation isn't great. And then something tragic happens with that relationship, and the story suddenly then jumps ahead to 2029, where Jack, who's much older now, discovers that he might have the possibility of traveling through time and preventing the tragedy from happening.
Okay, now this is interesting because when you were giving the premise just now, you said a tragedy happened. Do you feel that by revealing what that tragedy is, that would be a spoiler?
I don't know. Probably not. I mean, because it happens early. It was just a kind of, it was kind of a surprise to me because, like I said, I didn't know anything about it. But I don't think it would be terrible to reveal something that happens in the first 16 or so pages.
Yeah, I don't think that's a spoiler at all, because everything else in the narrative is premised on this event.
Right.
Because without that event, you really don't have the rest of the book.
Right.
And so, I mean, let's go ahead and just say that what happens is Jack comes back from work one day, and in fact, he decides that he's going to tell Patience the truth about his job. He's kind of stretched things a bit to give Patience the impression that he kind of has a job that he doesn't have. Mm-hmm. And so he goes home, he says, okay, I'm going to tell her the truth. And when he goes back home, he finds her dead. And so that is what drives him for the rest of the narrative. Mm-hmm. So, he's mourning the loss of his wife. The police suspect him, of course, and he serves some time. He gets out, and then, as you mentioned, next we find ourselves several years later in the year 2029. And then through various means, which I think are really interesting, we don't necessarily have to go into the detail there, he finds that he can travel through time. And for the rest of the book, we get transported to different periods. So we start off in 2012. We move forward, as we mentioned, into 2029, which is where Jack learns that it's possible to travel in time. We go back to 2006. Then we go way back, relatively speaking, to 1985. And then the last part of the book takes place in 2012, which is where we started things. So, temporally speaking, this is a circular narrative.
Yeah,
in some ways,
true.
Yeah. So, but some of the skipping around, it's not originally Jack's plan.
Right.
And I think that's part of the fun in how he gets where he goes in the years that he ends up.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, one of the things that I felt about this book is, the way it deals with the mechanics of time travel is, I don't know. a lot of stuff that we see in a lot of time travel stories, right? I was just, in fact, I've just recently just watched, I haven't gotten that far into it, but watched the first episode of the series on Hulu, 11/22/63.
Oh, okay.
Do you know that?
I know of it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's based on the Stephen King book where James Franco's character can go back in time to a certain day in 1960, and he's going to try to prevent the Kennedy assassination, but he's got 3 years basically to do it. And one of the things he brings with him is like a record of different sporting events, so that he can go into a betting parlor and bet on a game or a boxing match and make his money that way. And so, seeing that happen there, and then, like a few days later reading, that's one of the things Jack does to make money. And that's a kind of common trope in time travel stories or convention where, they'll do that. But one of the feelings I did get from this book personally was that there's a lot of time travel stuff in here that I've seen maybe too many times before, and I would have liked a more original take on time travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could definitely see that. It really is nothing new when it comes to time travel narratives. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I felt that Klaus is basically kind of having fun without making fun of the time traveling trope. And the reason why I see his fun, maybe even satiric fun with time travel, is that in this story, he definitely does not sweat the details. We're not given any kind of justification or explanation of any sort as to how he's able to do this. And even the devices that Jack ends up carrying with him. Mm-hmm. For instance, there's this, I don't even know if it's has a name, but it's a device that's yellow and it fits in the palm of his hand, mm-hmm. and it serves a variety of different functions.
Right.
It can destroy things, it can tape things, it can display things kind of like a cell phone or a smartphone. It can do a lot of things. And, after the first few functions that this device performed, I just kind of gave up trying to understand it and said, okay, this is just a do-everything device from the future. And again, there's no detail here, there's no explanation. He's just playing around with certain icons and certain tropes of time travel stories and just seeing where the hell things go.
Yeah. I was kind of glad that there isn't like an elaborate technical explanation of how the time travel works, or how, in particular, that device works. It's just a future device, and you don't need to know, right? And it just does these things. I was happy for that, because I think that is a place where time travel stories can often go off the rails, much in the way that a movie, like it with Alfred Hitchcock's concept of the MacGuffin. A movie can spend way too much time explaining what the MacGuffin is,
right? When
we don't really need to know anything about it. Like, we don't need to know how time travel works; it just does. Mm-hmm. And I'm happy with that. That being the case in this book.
Yeah, but I could definitely see your point that he's really doing nothing new, nothing original, really, with time travel in Patience. And I think, to some degree, Patience isn't a time travel narrative, but in some ways it is, because it's premised on the fact that he can travel through time. If you don't have the time travel, you really don't have the book that we have. But at the same time, because he doesn't emphasize the detail and try to explain the technology in any way, even roughly, it just seems kind of a looser time-traveling narrative than we usually find in time travel stories. Again, kind of falling back on our usual expectations of this kind of narrative and then leaving it at that. So I think that may be where some of the non-originality feeling you get comes from.
Yeah, and it may be. I've always been a sucker for time travel stories. So it may be, though, that for me, time travel is my new zombies. That's something I really enjoyed until I felt oversaturated with it.
Yeah. Oh, you think we have a lot of zombie stories? God, where have I been?
Yeah, and there are some really inventive moments. For example, when Jack the time travel takes a toll on him, either mentally or physically or both, and so Clowes really then does kind of kick up his psychedelic style in those passages, and I like those. Those were fun to look at.
Yeah, those were, visually speaking, the most compelling pages, and sometimes two-page spreads
right.
of this book. I really like those as well. And with some of the characters here, some strike me as, I guess I could call them classic Klaus characters. For instance, there's one character that when we see him at the very beginning, he's on television. He's a host of some sort. We don't have much detail. His name is Will. Once we get into the story, especially in the last half, we start learning more about who this character is. He strikes me, along with the friends of his that we see at one point in the 2006 section, are, I guess, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call them classic Klaus assholes. Because every now and again he will create characters that are just complete jerks. And not in kind of a nerdy way, but they think of themselves as kind of cool, they're hip, they're popular, but they're assholes. And that's what Will and his friends are. So those characters strike me as Klaus characters. And then another one is the time travel creator, I guess, someone by the name of Bernard or Bernie. So I guess you could say in reading Patience, in many ways we did feel the burn.
Oh.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But and he also strikes me as kind of a typical Klaus character because he's definitely an outsider, very nerdy. The way he appears, even when he is not decked out in his sci-fi travel garb that we see at the very end, he just looks ridiculous, even for a futuristic setting, because we first meet him in the 2029 section. He just looks like kind of a big dork.
Yeah, and his level of paranoia too, I felt was very Klaus-ish. That type of paranoid character is
Klaus-ish or Clousey?
Clousey? I don't know. Klaus-esque.
Which is better, yeah.
Klausian.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I think what I'm getting from what you're saying too is that for people who are fans of Dan Clowes' work, there are going to be things that they can latch on to here as being familiar characters, and I think style. There's a style here that is also very familiar.
Yeah, and speaking of both character and style, one of the things that I noticed in reading this is you get this in a lot of Clowes' comics when characters are talking maybe one with the other, or sometimes when they're thinking and we have access to their interior dialogue or monologue. It seems like they're looking off into space. They're very distracted. And so you can have two characters that are talking one with the other, but they're not looking at each other. They're looking off to the side or directly in front of them. And there's something a little spaced out about that. And there are a lot of instances of that in Patience.
That's a good point, because that's one of the things I was paying attention to certain ways, is how he stages dialogue and how he stages those kind of moments too, where we're getting the interior lives of the characters, like almost from the beginning, when Patience and Jack are talking on the on page 3. Clowes frames that conversation kind of right on what we would call the axis of action in film terms, where both of them are staring basically straight into the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that then for several panels following, which is it can be a little off-putting, because that's not necessarily they're usually, we all usually see characters at a little bit of an angle, and that conversation eventually does get to that point, but he does introduce us, first introduces us to Jack and Patience through silhouette, and then through, just looking straight into their eyes.
Yeah. Another thing that strikes me about Patience is I guess we could call it the narrative point of view, and I still don't know how to feel about this. I think it may take one or two more readings for me to get a better grasp of this. But basically, and see if this makes sense to you, we have three narrative perspectives. One I would call kind of a detached, not necessarily omniscient, but kind of a detached narrative perspective, and that's basically when you have one or more characters interacting and speaking in a way where there's no commentary that anyone's making to contextualize whatever it is that's being said or done. Then we have, and I think this is primarily what most of the book is, Jack's perspective.
Right.
And where he will have a lot of the dialogue boxes, usually at the top of the panels, and he's telling us what's going on with him as he's interacting with people, as he's walking down the street, as he's eating something. But then sometimes we have Patience's point of view, where she will be the one narrating to us to let us know what she's feeling, what she's thinking, what the context is. And I have to tell you, it was the Patience narrative perspective that kind of threw me, in that when we have a more detached perspective, that's fine. When we have Jack's point of view and his perspective, that's fine. In fact, that even makes perfect sense, because he's the one who's instigating the whole time travel thing to try to help and save Patience. But I don't want to say that it's awkward, but I maybe I did have that feeling when I first read this, that I felt that maybe Patience's point of view struck me at times as a little awkward. On the other hand, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have if we didn't have access to her point of view, there's some information that we could not have known from, let's say, Jack's point of view.
Right, and I think that for me, Patience's narrative works best in that last, I guess, third of the book when we return to 2012.
Yeah.
Again, that because we're getting scenes that we already got from Jack's point of view in the first third of the book, or first 20 pages or so, that that we're now starting to see how all that came together, and Patience, in 2012 with the knowledge she has, and that we now know that she has, that we didn't know she had at the beginning.
Right.
It makes those earlier scenes different. So you talked about this being a circular narrative. I think that's really true, and I also think that rereading the book and understanding where Patience actually is at the beginning of the book that we don't know in terms of her knowledge can make it a different experience going through another time.
Exactly. I have to say, the thing that I like best about Patience is what you just revealed, and that is in this last section, especially when we're back in the year 2012, we get repeating narratives. We get multiple instances of repeating narratives with some variation, but it's from her perspective primarily. And I think that adds to the thickness or the richness of the story that's being told here. I really enjoyed that. I think where I thought that the Patience point of view was a little off a bit, maybe awkward, or at least it stood out to me, was when we're in the year 2006.
Okay.
But again, much of that we would need her perspective. For instance, I mean, I think that section begins when we see her on a bus coming back to her hometown, not having been successful at school because, it was too expensive. So she's coming back, and that's where we first get her perspective. And that kind of threw me a bit. But also in that section, we get Jack's perspective, but then we come back to her, and I still don't know if it works for me or not.
Well, that's where we also start to get the idea that even from the beginning of the book, she knows more than we realize.
Right.
So that's the point where that starts. But I see what you're saying, and for readers who haven't seen it yet, basically. The shift of point of view is indicated when Patience's caption boxes are colored a yellow color, right? And Jack's are white,
white and gray, or grayish, whitish.
Yeah. So that's how that change in perspective is signaled if you weren't already kind of figuring it out by her being in the primary focus of the panel.
Yeah, and I think that knowing and giving readers who may not have read this yet that clue as to whose narrative perspective we have is largely determined by the color of the narrative box, right? Helps because, let me see, what page are we on here? This is one of those incredible 2-page spreads. This is 79 and 80. This is when Jack does something we won't reveal, and he has what seems to be, upon first glance, a psychedelic experience, but it's actually a time travel experience. You see what I'm referring to?
Yeah.
And then, the dialogue box, or the voiceover, whatever we want to call it, is so. Clearly, there's much to discuss. Before I start with all theory stuff, though, I want to get down to the basic events in writing while everything's still fresh in my mind. When I first read that, I thought, okay, well, this is Jack still narrating the events that are happening. But then I get to that next page, and it's Patience, and so that was her, because the box is yellow on the previous 2-page spread. So that's her. So it was a little confusing, and if you didn't key in on the fact that Klaus does have these color differentiations in terms of point of view, that may throw readers. At first, it threw me when I read this.
Yeah, and then we see Patience writing in her diary too, which is then the diegetic source, I guess, for that that narration.
And so her perspective lasts just for a couple of pages, and then we're thrown back into Jack.
Yep.
Which 1985, and he's there because of what we haven't revealed that happens to him on the previous few pages. It really is interesting, a book. I want to get back to something that I started off with. The 2 ways that I approach this. If I look at this within the context of the hype, I have one feeling. If I look at this without everything, the paratext and all that surrounding it, I feel a different way. When I first read this, I could not help but think of the hype. And this is the case not only with Patience, but other things that we have discussed on the Comics Alternative in the past few years. And 2 recent examples, let's say from 2015, immediately jump to mind. And that is Scott McCloud's The Sculptor and Adrian Tomaine's Killing and Dying. Especially with The Sculptor, but I think even to a large degree with Killing and Dying, there was quite a bit of publicity surrounding it. And it's understandable because, as with Klaus, it's not often that either of those come out with a new book. And especially someone like a McCloud, right? Because, that was fictional, and he's not known as a fiction comics artist as much as he is someone who does more, expository work like, understanding comics, making comics, or inventing comics. And I remember... there's a lot of publicity, a lot of hype around those books last year, and even though I liked both, I didn't think they were as good as the hype surrounding them. And neither of those books, if you remember, appeared on either of our best of 2015 list. For me, when something is hyped to such a degree, it's almost as if the book, unfortunately, has to prove something to me. Because I automatically become a resisting reader, right? So, okay, if this is such a big deal, then show me it's a big deal. And so I'm kind of defensive. And so as a reader, I say, show me that you're living up to everything about the publicity that's in the publicity behind this book. And I know that that's not anything that I should hold the writer accountable for, but I do it nonetheless. So the first time I read this, I had all of the hype and publicity in mind. I didn't like it as much. When I went back to reread it, I thought, okay, let's just read it for the story. This second time around, I'm able to pick up elements that I didn't the first time I read this. And I was able to appreciate it and feel much better about it after that. I have no idea how I will feel come December when you and I come up with our best of 2016. This may not appear, who knows. But I like the story better the second time around once I get over whatever psychological issues I have with the publicity of this book.
I kind of doubt that it'll be on my top 10 list, to be honest, unless I do, reread it a third time or something and have some kind of epiphany about it that I didn't get the first two times. But, I just really wonder in your kind of criticism of the publishers in these respects, like, what is the alternative? I mean, you have, for each of those three examples, you have, major creators that have, mainstream appeal, who get, reviewed in mainstream periodicals and so on. I think it would be natural for them to hype the fact that it's a new work by the creator. So is there an alternative method that you would suggest, or is it just kind of on you to quote Public Enemy, don't believe the hype?
I think the latter. I really don't think that there's an alternative, and I don't blame the publishers for what they're doing. I mean, I've worked in publishing. I've even worked in publicity departments, and so I know what they need to do, and rightly so, in order to get the word out, to sell copies, all of that.
Right.
And so I don't blame the publisher. I don't blame the marketing and publicity programs that are behind these projects. They're doing what they need to do, and you're right. These authors that I mentioned, there's Clowes, there's Tomini and McLeod, and then there are others we could name as well. They have wider mass appeal in terms of comic creators. And so why not? Why shouldn't the publicity department hype this and turn it into an event instead of a publication? It is an event. It's kind of like when a movie is released. I always hate that. It said, in a cinematic event. It's not an event. It's a movie release. 9/11, that's an event. The Donald Trump fiasco from last Friday, that was an event. This, it's a new book. It's on me to get around the publicity and the hype and the inflation of the significance of this. And I think that second time around, I'm better able, reading this book, I'm better able to do that. But the first time, again, prove it to me. If this is so damn good, show me. Show me what you got.
Yeah. When you mentioned those other two books. I mean, I with the Sculptor, I had real mixed feelings about that. I kind of appreciated what McLeod was doing, but I don't know if it was an entirely successful narrative. With Killing and Dying, I mean, Killing and Dying could have very well have been on my top 10 list. It's just that I didn't get it because I'd already read the stories in Optic Nerve. So that didn't even kind of, I mean, I saw a lot of stuff about it as a 2015 release, but that was for me more of the previous two issues of Optic Nerve.
Right.
But yeah, and so I didn't necessarily see. I mean, I again didn't see that one hyped that much, except that it ended up on a ton of year-end lists.
Yeah, and I like the book.
Yeah,
but then again, I like the individual issues of Optic Nerve.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I was able to look at it, as its own book from 2015, and did consider it as one of, as a possibility for one of my favorites from 2015. Mm-hmm. But there are other things that I thought were better, that resonated better with me. As much as I liked Killing and Dying, the older, the newer material doesn't matter. There are other things that I thought just clicked for me more. So
sure. Yeah, so I'll be curious to see how the reviews roll out for Patience.
Yeah, and I think I will have more respect for reviewers who treat it as a serious work of narrative and visual art, and don't just kowtow to the hype.
Okay.
Because I think that, again, coming back to the whole publicity thing, I mean, I'm just afraid that a lot of people will fall prey to what we see coming out of publicity departments. And it's easy to do. I mean, I know from being a reviewer, looking at popular works, even for someone as legendary in comics as Daniel Clowes, not everything he does can be gold.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this book is definitely worth getting. I wouldn't necessarily put it in my top 2 or 3 Dan Clowes works, but
no.
It is, it still is, it still is an event, like the way, I would read, I don't know, name an author who's not very prolific, and work every few years. I would read maybe like someone like Michael Chabon or somebody like that I'm kind of on the hook for, even if what they're doing is not as good as Cavalier and Clay or something like that. I would still read it.
Right. Well, Andy, before we move on to the second book we're discussing this week, let's remind our listeners that one of the sponsors of this episode is Just Coffee Co-op. If you go to justcoffee.coop, you'll find a variety of coffees, teas, and chocolates. And when you check out, after choosing a lot of great coffee, make sure you use the coupon code COMICS, COMICS. That'll give you 10% off of your order. So it'll help you, it helps us, and it also helps Just Coffee Co-op. So it's a win-win-win situation.
Yeah, and it helps the growers and the other people that Just Coffee Co-op supports.
So it's a win-win-win-win situation.
Yes. Everybody wins.
That's right. So everybody wins with Just Coffee Co-op. Okay, well, this second book we're discussing this week is Visual Storytelling, an Illustrated Reader. This is a reader edited by Todd James Pierce and Ryan G. Van Cleave. It's coming out from Oxford University Press, and this came out late last year. I think it was December, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it was only within the last month or so, maybe even less, that Oxford University Press has been doing their kind of, publicity, full court press, no pun intended, to get this book into hands of teachers who might be making their fall book decisions now.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I got it in the mail just a few weeks ago. And I noticed a bunch of my colleagues were getting it too, so Oxford really went out to put it out. And then I eventually, I think in total, got 3 copies of this book.
Yeah. Now, and this is interesting because I know you alerted me to this back in early February, and I hadn't heard of it.
Right.
And that's one of the things that surprised me, the fact that this has been out since at least December, and we didn't know about it for 1 or 2 months. You would think that word would have gotten out. I mean, not necessarily directly to us, but we would have heard about this through other means, and I didn't until you brought it to my attention.
Yeah, and I guess, kind of knowing how textbook publishing works, December is often the time in which new textbooks roll out, but that's really not necessarily the time that people are, faculty are looking for textbooks to use in class. So it does usually take a couple months for those to get in. That's why, also from my experience, that the royalty check you get in for the first 6 months of the year is usually way less than the royalty check you get for the second 6 months. But that's how that stuff goes. Yeah. But anyway, when I saw this, I was actually really excited about it because and we've even talked about this on the podcast a little bit early on, especially, and talked about this privately as well, about the absence of a kind of a comic anthology textbook.
Right.
So I'm glad to see that someone's done this.
Yeah, and I think, to me, this is the most exciting thing about visual storytelling, this collection, is that it's the first instance of a reader, an anthology reader, that is specifically created for the classroom. Now, we have had a variety of other anthologies, comics anthologies, over the past several years. I mean, obviously, there's the Best American Comics series, but we also have the 2 volumes that Yale University Press came out with a few years ago. And then there's the McSweeney's anthology, which actually is one of my favorite anthologies. So there's really no lack of potential anthologies that, given certain circumstances, an instructor could use in the classroom. Now, the main circumstance is primarily price, I think. Do you want to get a textbook that is going to be quite expensive? And many of these anthologies are. Even if you do use those anthologies in the classroom, one of the things that you will not get is what you get in visual storytelling, because it is a textbook and it's written to be used in the classroom. You get quite a bit of supplemental material that goes to the pedagogical efficacy of visual storytelling. For instance, you get, after each story, a series of questions or prompts, ideas for exercises, and in reading through all of these, I mean, I find these quite valuable.
I want to back up a second and just add to your list of anthologies for classroom use. Not really an anthology, but there was a couple years ago, Bedford St. Martin's put out that Understanding Rhetoric, a graphic guide to writing.
Well, that's right,
which Kevin Cannon and Xander Cannon did the art for, which is basically a rhetoric book. And there's even, I don't have it in front of me now, that film textbook, Filmish. Did you get a copy of that?
Yeah.
And there's that.
Was Self-Made Hero.
Yeah. But again, not really having the apparatus of a textbook like you're describing with visual storytelling. And then just last year, Josh Elder put together the book Reading with Pictures, which is more of a text, is an actual textbook with comic stories in it, but that's geared more towards younger readers. So it has sections on language arts, science, mathematics, and social studies, that for elementary school readers, but then also has a bit of an apparatus for them as well. But visual storytelling is really, when you talk about the prompts that are in it and so on, it really does seem aimed at a composition class. That if you wanted to use a reader instead of and there's also, I should mention, 2 other anthologies and readers for composition classes that include comics but aren't exclusively comics.
Right.
But this one is totally comics, but it has the kind of writing prompts and discussion questions that you would get in a regular literature anthology.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And what you pointed out is that this could be used in composition classes. Mm-hmm. I think it gives it for me an even stronger appeal. You could use this book in a course devoted to comics, no problem at all. Mm-hmm. It's obvious. But you could also use this in other courses that may deal with writing or literary studies in a broader sense.
Sure.
In other words, the way that the editors have pulled everything together, the way that the kind of comics that they've created, the prompts that they include, the exercises that they have at the end of each section. Again, they can be used in any number of classes. So this is a book for you, even if you have no interest whatsoever in teaching comics proper. Either the history of the comics or understanding or reading comics from an aesthetic point of view. I mean, you can use this for any number of things. And I think that the viability of this book comes in the way that it's divided. There are 7 sections of visual storytelling, and each section has about 5, 6 different, maybe sometimes more, comics. Sometimes as little as 4, I think, per section. And they're grouped by theme. And I like these themes, and they're not what I would call the usual suspects of themes. It's really interesting how both Pierce and Van Cleave have titled the sections. The first one's identity. The second one is men and women. The third, young adulthood. Then trauma. Then history, then politics, and then they wrap up with, I guess, the briefest section. It only has 2 entries, and that is the arts. Mm-hmm. And the way I like, one of the reasons why I like that they named these sections the way that they did is it kind of gives a little more wiggle room to where you could go with them. I mean, I could see them easily turning or calling that section that they have as men and women as gender. Right. But you can read this section and use this section in the classroom, men and women, in terms of gender studies, but you can use it for much more than that as well.
Right.
So I think the naming of these sections was quite strategic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And, I find some of the apparatus in here I find useful, and some of it not necessarily useful. For example, after the Linda Berry story San Francisco, it asks readers to go find the Scott McKenzie song if you're going to San Francisco, and that would lose my students immediately. They may have more luck if they went to, or they appreciate more from kitsch value if they went to find the Paula Abdul song that Love Me Forever, Oh, by Jeremy Cerisi is based on. But it's interesting that some of there's a lot of the questions in here that ask students to go find something else out there. Go find a song, go find a video on YouTube, go find a movie, a particular movie. And it is one of the first anthologies I've seen that's really kind of aware of how students get information and what information students have at their fingertips. Mm-hmm. And so, finding the stuff that's kind of ancillary to the book is good. I'd also would more want my students to go get the songs that are referenced in Durf's story that's in here.
In fact, Durf has 2.
Yeah, what is it? The one?
The Bank.
The Bank. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm glad you mentioned Durf, Durf's contributions to this collection, because, I have to tell you, my impression of visual storytelling is I really like this book in a variety of different ways. I think that it's much needed, it's useful. As we've discussed, we do have other anthologies, but this is a different kind of anthology. We do have other textbooks that are comics related, but we don't have readers like this. I mean, I could see if someone wanted to teach a comic studies course, they could use, let's say, The Power of Comics as a critical text, and then use visual storytelling as a reader to supplement what they discuss with the Power of Comics. So, I mean, it's much needed. So I like it in a variety of ways. I like the thematic breakdown, all of that. But there are places in visual storytelling, getting back to the DERF sections, I'm wondering why the repetition of some creators. Now, Derf Back Derf has 2 stories in this collection. His a story that we've referenced already, The Bank, appears in the young adulthood section, and then a part of My Friend Dahmer is in the history section. Okay, but we also have other creators who have 2 contributions. There is Peter Cooper. He has a section from Stop Forgetting to Remember in the arts section that concludes the book, and then in that previous section, politics. Ceci n'est pas un comique, another contribution. And then we have Gabriel Bell, who has not 1, not 2, but 3 entries in the book in 3 different sections. She's in the men and women section, she's in the young adulthood section, and where else is she? She has 2 in the young adulthood section.
Yeah.
Now, I like all of their work. I mean, everything that Bell has, I like. Everything that Backdorf does, I like. Same thing with Cooper. However, as editors, I'm wondering if Pierce and Van Cleave didn't stop and think, is there another story or an excerpt that we could substitute so there's less repetition, especially with Gabriel Bell?
Well, I wondered that too, and then I had my thought on that. Again, kind of knowing how textbooks work, but also, kind of currently having issues with getting permissions from other publishers or from other creators. I wonder what the logistics of putting together a book like this are anyway. Right. And they managed to get the things that you would hope an anthology like this would have. That is, there's a selection from Fun Home, there's an Art Spiegelman selection, and
I'm glad it's not Mouse, by the way.
Yeah, and there's a selection from Persepolis, and then there's there's Crumb's classic. Was it A Short History of America? And I would even include, and then and Joe Sacco, and I would even include Derf's My Friend Dahmer. Oh, and John Lewis, Andrew Aiden, and Nate Powell's March. So there's those kind of things that are kind of a little sort of no-brainers, as far as what are really, really teachable, but also canonical.
Right.
Works.
People know about them.
You're right. And so I really commend the editors for managing to get that. Then, with the others, I could imagine putting together a book like this, and if I had a creator like Gabriel Bell who's willing to have her stuff put in there, that and is not as much trouble as, say, some other creator might be to get their stuff in, that you might go to that well a couple more times.
Exactly, and I thought about that as well, especially when it comes to permission costs.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, there is tons of really good comics out there that they could easily find substitutes for some of these double and triple dips. I was thinking one of the ways that the editors almost kind of rationalize the inclusion of not 2 but 3 Gabriel Bell pieces is they say in each of the intro bits, in each of these segments, we have brief introductions of who the artists are, where they're from, just the basics. But they say in the intro pieces to Gabriel Bell that she is a master of the short story in comics form, and that's why they include her, because they work really well in a reader like this.
Yeah.
And I believe that. I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. However, there are other comics creators that are masters of the short story form that I'm sure they could easily get their work included in here. I mean, one that leapt immediately to mind is Joe Ullman. In fact, I think that Joe Ullman is much more of a master of the short story form than Gabriel Bell. As much as I like her, he's not near as well known. as Gabriel Bell. So again, I think maybe by expanding or flexing things a little more, they could have cut down on the repetition. All of that being said, though, it really didn't bother me, which may sound weird because we're spending a lot of time, or I'm spending a lot of time talking about this. I mean, I'm okay with 3 Gabriel Bell stories because I really like Gabriel Bell, but I'm just wondering, as an editor, I would think, let's see if I can find a lesser-known work, or one that maybe is perhaps even more affordable and just as good in terms of getting permission and inclusion in the reader.
Sure. I feel like we should just record a conversation about every anthology that we ever talk about, with you talking about why didn't the editors do this, and me going, I'm not going to second guess the editor's decisions. But I do think it would be something if you were to look at a if you were to get a fiction anthology or for a class, and there were multiple works by a single author, unless there was some kind of compelling reason where, for example, there might be writing prompts asking you to compare and contrast certain authors' works, and some anthologies do that. For the most part, most anthologies don't, at least fiction anthologies don't take multiple works by the same author.
Right.
So this would be, this would seem odd in another context. It might be different for a poetry anthology, but if we were to compare this kind of one-to-one to some kind of other reader that you might use in a classroom, that would definitely stand out. But again, I really commend Pearson Van Cleave for doing this anyway, because I've talked to textbook publishers about the idea of doing some kind of comics anthology before, and the response I always got was, "Oh, that would be a nightmare."
No. And I'm sure it was for Pearson Van Cleave. They just had the fortitude to stick it out, I guess.
Yeah. And more power to them. I really respect that this exists at all. After that, and again, after seeing kind of not only in my own experience, currently dealing with permissions, but just when my wife Jennifer does work, does textbooks that are published by Pearson, and just seeing how much time they have to spend dealing with permissions and stuff, I just can't imagine what this was like. So if I ever run into Pearson Van Cleave, I would like to ask them about it. And I know Ryan Van Cleave, I've seen he's done some other textbooks for Oxford as well, so he may just be an old hat at it.
Yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe in a future episode we can have them on for an interview. Yeah. That'd be interesting to ask them about the backstory of the creation of visual storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier that this is a great combination of both well-known names and lesser-known creators. And, while I do appreciate some of the more well-known names, or we can even call them the usual suspects here, I mean, of course you knew that we'd have something from Persepolis there. Of course you knew we'd have Alison Bechdel and Art Spiegelman. And as much as I enjoyed those contributions, I got most excited with some of these lesser-known creators. Even, I think most of these stories I had read previously. There were some that I hadn't seen before, and some we've seen in other anthologies. I think, didn't we see Love Me Forever 000 in the Best American Comics volume? Or am I mistaken there?
I'm not entirely sure. I didn't.
Because I've seen it somewhere.
Yeah. Usually they say if it's been in one of those, but I didn't. I've never seen that one before.
But the one that I was most excited to see in this collection is Jonathan Bennett's Dance with the Ventures. Mm-hmm. I had not read that since it came out in an early volume of Mome.
Yeah.
I loved that story when it first came out, and I had forgotten about it. And then to see it it's in the young adulthood section.
Right.
It's a great short story.
Yeah, it is. It does seem like there's more than one thing that came from Mome in here. I'm trying to remember what else I'm thinking of, but it does seem like Mome was a place that they went for some of their source material, which is good.
Yeah, and I know we've said this on the show several times before, but I'll say it again. I mourn the loss of Mome.
Sure.
I love that series. Mm-hmm. Another thing that I was really happy to see is Kevin Huizinga's Pulverize. It's one of his Glengangie stories.
Yeah.
That's really good. And actually, that I didn't count the pages, but that's one of the longest contributions in this reader.
Yeah, that's pretty long. I mean, would that have been a whole issue of Ganges, maybe?
Yeah, and I can't remember what issue, but it would strike me as about that long, yeah.
Uh-huh. And, and that's when I was going to comment on, too, because I would hope that let's see, yeah, because it was 20, a little over 20 pages. But I would hope that maybe some kid reading this book would have gotten to that and wanted more.
Right.
And gone and gotten some of the other works. One of the things I was thinking of, and again, I don't want to second guess the editors, but in the Yale book, that Ivan Brunetti edited that, right?
Right.
That includes the original Richard Maguire here story, and I would have liked to have seen that, but then at the same time, Martin Sandrada's La Brea Woman, which also I think, he is published in Mome. I can't remember if this was in Mome. Kind of does something similar, and in its way it uses time.
Yeah, and it may have been in Mome, because this is one that I have read before, but I can't remember where.
And so one of the things I did like about this book, and even starting out with Love Me Forever, was a pretty bold move, because that is such an unconventional comic narrative that immediately, if you start students reading from the first story, you're going to get, they're going to get something that automatically challenges just the way they read comics. And so I like to see that there were a lot of works like that too. That, again, if you were teaching this less as a composition class and more as a comics analysis class, there's more than enough stuff in here to talk about experimentation in comics form, like Avril and Petit Roulet's virtually silent story.
Right, the 63 Rue de la Grange au Bel. Yeah.
Yeah. And then getting back to La Brea Woman, how the caption boxes deal with time in a different way than the kind of linear visual narrative that you get in that story. So there's a lot to talk about with that as well.
Exactly. And I like all the contributions. I can't say that I'm in complete agreement as to where some of these contributions appear. I'll give you a couple examples. In the section on history, as much as I like Joseph Lambert's, Anne Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller, Yeah, it is anchored in history, but is this the most appropriate or one of the most appropriate stories to include in the history section? I mean, again, I'm kind of second-guessing the editors here, but it just strikes me that there are a lot of other candidates that would be a much better fit. Now, to both Pierce and Van Cleave's benefit, they do say at a couple of points that many of these stories could be placed in another section instead of where they actually are. Mm-hmm. It just strikes me that the Anne Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller is not the best fit in history.
I thought that was good.
I mean, it's a good comic. I just don't think that it's the best fit in being in the history section.
Oh, well, I disagree with you there.
Okay, well, see, it strikes me, and there are one or two other sections. For instance, My Friend Dahmer is one. As much as I like that, that seems to be more biography than history. And so I don't think that they made a clear enough distinction between that, and maybe they didn't need to, maybe they felt they didn't want to, and that's fine. It's just I saw those as non-history-based comic texts and more having to do with personages or biography, which are a part of history. So, I mean, again, ultimately it does make sense. It just didn't seem the best fit for me. Another example is in the arts, and as I mentioned, that's the shortest section in this book. And the very last of the two stories here makes perfect sense to me. Chris Ware's fiction versus nonfiction. Mm-hmm. Because it does forefront the process of arts and the creative process, which is what this section is about. What they include, though, before that is a selection from Peter Cooper's Stop Forgetting to Remember, the autobiography of Walter Kurtz. Mm-hmm. I really like that book. I just thought that the section that they included went on a little too long, because the longer the section, the excerpt from the book went on, the less I thought it had much to do directly with the arts. I mean, again, it does ultimately make sense to me. I just thought it wasn't the best fit, at least the length of the excerpt that they have in there. But, again, I'm second guessing.
That is, I think, from what I can see, that may be the longest excerpt that's in here. It's that goes to about 24 pages.
Yeah, I was thinking as I was reading this that I would stop it right at around the time, this is on page 479, when Kurtz's wife puts her hand in front of the lens, so to speak, of the panel and says, "I get final edit on my panels." In other words, they're getting ready to have sex. Mm-hmm. And she's telling the reader, go away. I would have ended things there, and I think that the way that panel ends with the breaking of the fourth wall, it would be a perfect place to end in a section dealing with the creation of comics, the arts.
Okay.
But, other than, I mean, again, those are more nitpicks than otherwise. I got one other nitpick. And this is in the for further reading section at the end. And this is great, by the way. I'm glad that they do that. What they do is in the further readings pages, this is on 501, 502, is they list by those sections, the 7 sections, other text that they could have included. It makes perfect sense. The one nitpick is under Men and Women is by Linda Berry, 100 Women. Did you notice that?
Oh, no, I didn't notice that. That is a little bit of a proofreading oversight.
Yeah, and for those who may not get it, the actual title of that book is 100 Demons. But it's in the section of Men and Women, so I guess that's where the mistake came from.
But that's a weird one to include anyway, because they've already included the San Francisco story is in 100 Demons.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if they didn't mean, oh crap, what's her other? No, there's one that's called like Naked Ladies or something like that. Maybe they meant that, but I doubt it. But yeah, and also, well, this entry also they put the exclamation marks after each word. That's since I've been recently writing about that book. Right. By Linda Berry, I struggle with whether that's how you do the title or not. Separating each word with an exclamation point. I know the criticism that is written about it doesn't do that.
Yeah. And, this list that they include at the very end for further reading, I mean, this is a great list as well. Had visual storytelling included excerpts from these other books instead, it would have been just as strong, I think. Although I do have to say that if I were Alex Robinson, who actually we interviewed late last year, if I were looking at this list for further reading, I would get depressed because 2 of his books are on there under the Men and Women section, Box Office Poison, and under the Trauma section, Tricked. I would just think he's looking at this and going, why didn't you include it then?
Or, maybe they tried.
Yeah, maybe he said, no, I do not want you to reproduce my work.
Or he said, money, 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 money.
Yeah, I really don't think that was the case. Because I have communicated with him a number of times, even outside of the context of comics, and he just doesn't strike me as that kind of guy.
Yeah.
But who knows? But yeah, this is a great list. You look at for further readings. You have Dashaw's Bottomless Belly Button, Gilbert Hernandez's Marble Season, Will Eisner's Last Day in Vietnam Under Trauma. A lot of great recommended reading and a lot of good texts in the reader section proper.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And outside of those few nitpicks that I have, I think this is, for the very first textbook reader we have in comics, devoted to comics, this is an outstanding job.
Yeah, and I could see myself using this in a class. I was just looking it up on Amazon to see how much it would be for students, and it actually runs about $50.
Wow, that much?
Well, when I think about, for example, the film textbook I use, Bordwell and Thompson's Film Art, now runs over $100.
Oh God!
So $50 is actually, I think a student would look at that in the bookstore and compare that to their $200 accounting textbook or their $150 biology textbook and go, whew.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, you're right. $50 does seem a little much, but compared to other textbooks, yeah this is cheap.
From back in our day, $50 would have been an expensive book. But
right.
I found one of my old history textbooks, and I think I paid $18 for it.
Wow.
And now I look at what the students are paying for their textbooks, and I'm like, yeah, that's nuts. I would have had to take out a second student loan to get, to pay, $500-$600 for a semester's worth of textbooks.
Yeah. But
so how they, again, $50 seems like a lot, but when you think about everything that's in there, I also wonder how they kept that cost that low.
Right, yeah, because they do have to deal with permissions. At the same time, though, this is Oxford University Press, and as you insinuated earlier, they're printing buttloads of these things and just sending them out to instructors for free. So, we know they've printed up a lot of them, and the more you print, the cheaper the book becomes. So, there's that as well. See, I think that it makes sense that a publisher like Oxford University Press does this because a much smaller press probably wouldn't have been able to do it at all.
Yeah.
With permission costs.
Right. I'm curious to see how this takes off anyway, because the textbook business is contracting right now, and so I'll be really. And it seems like, from the stuff I'm getting in the mail too, from different textbook publishers, that they're trying a wide variety of different experiments to find something that sticks. Especially since a lot of teachers are just going away from textbooks altogether. Again, because the cost is so prohibitive for students. So I would really hope that this does succeed, and that maybe in a few years we would see even a second edition of this book with with a slightly different lineup.
Right. Well, we had a productive conversation with the two books that we're looking at for this week. We started off with the new book from Daniel Clowes, Patience, and then we took our time in looking through a really great reader, textbook reader, visual storytelling and illustrated reader, edited by Todd James Pierce and Ryan G. Van Cleave. So two really good books, and we hope, we've been talking primarily about visual storytelling as a textbook, but, when we were preparing for this, I had the opportunity to read this from front to back, as I would any book, like I did with Patience. So you can read this outside of the classroom, so it doesn't have to be part of the classroom experience. So you can pick this up for $50 or so on Amazon, and you have a great collection of comics.
Yeah, and it's 500 and some pages, so it's not a slight book either for that.
Right. This is not Beanbag. This is my second Bernie reference for the episode, in fact.
Great.
So if you want to find great books like the ones that Andy and I discussed this week, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to dcbservice.com, you're going to find great deals every single month. And then after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think about this episode. If you go to the Comics Alternative website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use, and quick. Or, if you want to be a little more difficult about things, you can call us over the telephone. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you could get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at #2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us elsewhere on social media, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. And we like to hear from you, and we look forward to talking with you next week. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.